I told you that selling your leasehold flat was going to cost you at least £5,000 to sell it, what would you say? Because selling mine very nearly cost me £16,000 and it was the most stressful experience of my life. I've spoken before about selling my leasehold property, but I've never actually got down to the nitty-gritty and shared a full comprehensive breakdown of all the costs that were involved in selling my leasehold property. So in today's video, I wanted to shed the light on the realities of selling a leasehold property in today's market and how much it really costs to sell a leasehold property. Before we get into the video, I'm Nicole from Sleek-chic Interiors. I share lots of videos about my leasehold experience to help others who are perhaps selling or looking to purchase leasehold property. So if that's of interest to you, please hit that subscribe button before we get into the video. Okay, so I have been back through all my emails, I've been through all my bank statements, so I can bring you this video that is completely accurate. And just before we get started, I purchased my flat back in 2017. It was a one-bedroom flat in Plymouth and I eventually started the selling process late 2021 and it eventually sold in 2022. So these figures aren't going to be too dissimilar. There has definitely been some things that have changed in leasehold since I've sold, which could obviously make things a little bit more expensive, but I'm going to break everything down right from the beginning just to give you a really good idea of how much it actually costs to sell a flat. Let's get started. I've got everything in front of me here and I'm going to pop everything up on the screen so you can see it broken down as we go. Okay, so number one, I had to get my property obviously listed onto the market. I went with Yopa and they are one of the cheapest estate agents on the market because they are online. And that was £899. Secondly, we had to get our solicitor selected, and I will state here that leasehold selling fees are somewhat a little bit more expensive than freehold because the additional amount of work that is involved. And another thing to mention is some solicitors don't even touch leasehold properties because of this. So the cost to the solicitor, including everything, was £1,640.94. So the first thing that a leasehold flat will entail, which a freehold sale doesn't, is an LPE1 form or a management pack. Now this I've mentioned multiple times on some videos with how expensive it costs. Now the LPE1 form is not legally required for selling a flat. However, solicitors will always request this information, and if you aren't able to provide it, the buyer is probably going to pull out, especially if they are requiring a mortgage. Now if you've got a cash buyer, they might not be interested, but realistically every flat that is being sold does need to have an LPE1 form. I'm going to tell you how much it costs to get mine. People say on average that an LPE1 form is about £250. Now I never understand that because every single freeholder and managing agent can charge whatever they like based on their terms. So my managing agent was the first port of call who said they would answer everything. Now this was £240. I thought this was pretty reasonable, definitely within the average budget there, and it took 10 days for them to return it. It was only later on in the process that the solicitor said 2 questions hadn't been filled out and my freeholder had to answer this. My freeholder said that for those 2 questions to be answered, it was another £600. Now at this stage, if you don't like the cost, you're just not going to get what you want, and I had to have these 2 questions completed to be sold, and at this point so much other water had gone under the bridge, so I just had to pay it. And the worst part was it literally came back within 10 minutes completed. The total cost for the LPE1 form was £840. Like I said in this video, this might not necessarily refer to your leasehold sale, but I need to include everything that was involved in my sale because leasehold flats are a law of their own. There's going to be complexities because of the lease, so that is why I'm going to include everything in this. The next thing was the developer of the flat had never registered an individual EPC for each flat. Instead, they submitted it for the entire property, which my solicitor at the time had accepted and was obviously negligent. I also had no idea anything about EPC back then. So instead of getting an EPC rating, I had to get something called a SAP. And this is essentially done at the stage of developing a property because they have to work out different values of each walls based on insulation and what building materials you've used. And I'm not going to pretend I still know what this is, but this was a part that really caused just another nail in the coffin for me in selling my flat. I had to sit there and work out and try and contact the old builder to work out what the hell the insulation was that was used in the building. Firstly, I had to pay £432. When that rating came back to me, it was rated at an E, which meant that I wouldn't be able to sell it to anyone that wanted to let it out because the rating was too low. And it took me a couple of weeks to think, right, I'm going to have to get this sorted. And obviously I had to then go back and have a look, try and find pictures of building work. And this was just completely complicated. I had no idea what I was doing. No one was able to help me. The developer had fled the country years ago, and eventually we had to get those values redone, but of course that came at an additional cost and additional work to the person that did it, and that was an additional £120. So all in all, that palaver cost an extra £552. So the next thing that came back, and the reason we need LPE1 packs is because it opens up questions for the solicitor. There was a query that came back in regards to the flooring. So in the lease it states that you cannot have wooden flooring in any of the rooms except for the kitchen and the bathroom. Now, the kitchen and the living room was an open plan shared area, so having a little bit of carpet in one area and then laminate flooring would have looked absolutely ridiculous. And obviously the developer had created this lease, he knew what was in the flat, so I just thought it was ridiculous, but the buyer was just not dropping it. Now, this is when they requested a deed of variation, which at this point I was just like, not even going to consider this is ridiculous. So we settled on an indemnity policy. The indemnity policy was £70.84. Now, indemnity policies are really common practice in leasehold and freehold properties when there's something you can't really kind of prove, and this indemnity policy will just go some way at protecting them if anything was to ever come back in regards to the flooring. Now, the next part, which could have literally cost me £16,000, was to do with the ground rent. As you may be aware if you're in the process yourself right now, if you have ground rent which is over £250 per year, it's classed as an assured short hold tenancy. Now, this basically means that if you were to fall into arrears of your ground rent over a period of time, the freeholder would be able to take possession of your property. I don't actually know of a time of this ever happening, but it is a potential of forfeiting your property. So the solicitor asked for a deed of variation to cap the ground rent at £250. Now, the reason this was requested is because the mortgage lender said they would not lend unless a deed of variation was in place. So the deed of variation costs would have involved £840 for an initial inquiry. This is just to work out whether they're actually going to say yes or no. If they were to say yes, it's going to be £800 heads of terms to be drawn up, and it would be £2,400 of their legal costs that I would have to pay for. At this point, this doesn't include any of my legal costs, and the next part would have been the premium. Now, the premium is worked out on that amount of ground rent they're capping it at and how many years are kind of left on the lease in simple terms. Now, I worked this out on a calculator and it was working out around £16,000, which of course I could not afford, and I just felt sick. I was like, I'm never ever going to sell this flat. So much has already cropped up. It's already cost me an absolute fortune. How is this right? And I did so much research because at the time no one was talking about it online. There was a few forums, but it seems that this issue only started in around 2021, so it was kind of quite new. I'd already decided there was no way I could do the deed of variation, and I wanted to offer an indemnity policy to their lender. Now, the indemnity policy was called a forfeiture of lease indemnity policy, and from some stroke of luck they accepted it, and to this day I still feel that relief, how amazing it felt that they accepted it. And it did take 2 weeks for them to come back and say so, and the cost of that was a grand total of £55 and £69, but it could have cost me £16,000. And That to me is just absolutely madness. I just want to reiterate, this was my experience, and since 2022, restrictions around ground rent have become even more difficult, and a lot of lenders aren't accepting indemnity policies, and that is because their lender's handbook updates quite frequently, and they're continually seeing ground rent or onerous ground rent levels as a real problem with affordability. So let's go on to the last lot of fees. We're totting up quite a bit right now. When we're getting closer to closing the process, you typically have to pay something called a retention fee. Now, you don't have to pay for the retention fee, but again, did I want my buyer to pull out? No, I was literally happy to keep handing over hundreds of pounds at this point, like it was literally pocket money. Now, I had to pay a retention fee of £250. Retention fee is something that your solicitor holds if the buyer feels that the next year accounts for service charging is much different to what was obviously laid out in your LPE1 form. So that £250 is held with the mindset that I might get it back or I might not get it back in the future. I will actually state now, 18 months later, I eventually got my retention fee back, which was a very nice surprise and a final exit from Leasehold for me. The next few figures I am going to include, I'm going to explain them a bit more. When you sell a property, you always have to pay what is called an apportionment of your ground rent and service charge, and this is basically the difference between what is due by the time you complete your property and what you haven't already paid. So I had a ground rent apportionment of £89.09, and my service charge apportionment was £358.35. But that was not all. During this time, our managing agent had issued obviously new service charges accounts for the year, but also building insurance. Our building insurance was added on top, and compared to the previous year, it had gone up an extreme amount, and they never provided us with quotes. They only ever used one provider, and it's obviously become clear why they have done that now, because they make a lot of commission on certain insurance providers that they work with. So during this period of time, none of the leaseholders in our property had paid for any of it because it was being challenged, and we were just saying we're not paying anything until it's kind of been challenged and been brought back to us. But because I was selling the property, I had no choice, but I had to pay it. If I hadn't paid it, the property wouldn't have gone through, end of. So the amount that I had to pay to the management company was £904.77. And I wasn't really in service charge arrears. It was this outstanding building insurance, among some other things that I'd just been holding on to. But I wanted to include that there because there's so many people involved in the selling process, and there is a lot of money that is changing hands and you will be saying bye to. I've actually had to film this part of the video sharing the grand total twice because I couldn't quite believe what it actually came out at, and I had to double check my figures. The grand total is £5,660.68, and this is the first time I've ever sat down and worked out the total, and I really feel quite sick about it right now. The reason I've done this video today is because there's very little information still online about how much it really costs to sell a flat, and the only people making these sorts of videos are estate agents or mortgage advisors. If you've not had a leasehold property yourself, you can't really give the true figures that are involved in selling the property. Whether you're about to sell or you're considering leasehold, I know it sounds a little bit backwards, but you kind of have to understand the complexities of selling a leasehold property and how much it can actually cost you. So if you're selling your leasehold property now, or if you sold in the past, how does this sound in comparison to your selling fees? I'd really love to hear other people's experiences because it just really helps build up kind of evidence of people that are looking to buy leasehold, and obviously those that are in the selling process as well. I find it really interesting because one freeholder to another freeholder charges completely different, and I just find it super interesting with this ridiculous leasehold system that we have here in England. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed watching today's video. Please do give it a thumbs up if you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you on my next one.